That's the most important capacity in which I speak tonight. And it is a pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Peter Bunton. He and I have been working together basically since I became Dutchess County historian. And I've always been impressed with his depth of knowledge, and it just continues to grow along with the list of the positions he's holding. So back before 2018, he was the director of the education manager for Historic Hudson Valley. He holds a master's degree in historical studies with an emphasis on public history from the University of Maryland in Baltimore County. And he is a native of Poughkeepsie, but currently lives down in the Bronx. So we're very happy to have him joining us digitally tonight. But now, since retiring, instead of taking it easy, Peter has become the chairman of the Mid-Hudson Anti-Slavery History Project, which is based here in Dutchess County. He's also the vice president of the Underground Railroad Consortium of New York State, which is a magnificent and growing organization. We look forward to seeing a lot more information coming out from them, and of course from Peter as we approach the bicentennial of the elimination of slavery in New York in 2027. And Peter is also a trustee of the Dutchess County Historical Society. So Peter, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Will, and thanks, Elizabeth, although I guess you've gone back. And thank everyone. Oh, you are still here, Elizabeth, great. And thanks everyone for coming tonight to hear the program. It's also an honor for me to be able to work with Elizabeth and Will and the great history community that we have here in Dutchess County. It's really fabulous, and there's a lot of great stuff going on. One of the things I like best is exploring and talking with people about the links between our national history and the events that took place right here in Dutchess County. And that's certainly going to be undergirding tonight's story. I'm going to give you a broad brush look at the slavery and anti-slavery history here, a primer, if you will. We're going to cover a lot of topics in a short time, and perhaps we'll have some time at the end to answer your questions. So for context, let's remember that slavery in America was not just an historical curiosity, all of us living here in the North now. It was a worldwide system that ended up in the deportation and slaughter of millions of Africans and the establishment of chattel slavery here in the Western Hemisphere. European powers looked to Africa for trade in cloth, rice, metals, etc., and people in order to build these new colonial societies. The purchased and captured people who were traded or sold for enslavement marked the start of what would usher in a new era of slavery and change the relationship between Europeans and Africans, and soon enough between Americans and Africans. This map shows the destinations of Africans taken out of their countries and brought across to places in South and North America. 12.5 million Africans were removed, a massive shift of population. This occurred over a period of roughly 300 years, beginning in the late 15th, early 16th century. The total number of Africans shipped directly to North America was relatively small compared to, say, Brazil. Less than 400,000 went into the Gulf Coast and up the eastern seaboard. But many others, so-called seasoned slaves, came into America after first spending time in the West Indies. For those having to make the Atlantic voyage, the Middle Passage, the trip on the slave ships, was perhaps the most horrible. Africans were stored below deck, naked, chained, lying tightly packed. Many captives attempted to jump overboard, even with little hope of surviving. Trips could take as long as 3 months, and the mortality rate was 12 to 15%, estimated at around 1.5 million African deaths during this period. One of the slave ships embedded in that line of map came very close to our own home. In 1685, the Charles, a ship owned by Frederick Phillips, who was one of the wealthiest men in the colony, was sent to Africa to purchase men and women and bring them back to sell. The captain of the Charles purchased 146 Africans, and the return trip, first to Barbados, took 12 weeks. Only 105 survived this part of the trip. After selling 82 at Barbados, the Charles, with 23 remaining Africans, headed toward New York. During this part of the trip, 14 more Africans perished. That's about a 38% loss of life. The ones who finally arrived at what is now Rye were marched across to Tarrytown, and they formed the nucleus of the first of several dozen enslaved men, women, and children who would build the manor house, barn, gristmill, and church. The original church and manor house, along with a replica gristmill and a period true Dutch barn, can be seen at Phillipsburg Manor today. Just 8 years later, in 1693, our Duchess would be designated one of the original 10 counties in the New York colony. From Westchester all the way up to modern-day Albany, the land had been granted in huge chunks, owned and run by barons, a la Frederick Phillips, or their appointees. Not many farmers, not many settlers, American or European, found conditions there hospitable. But from its birth in 1693 until 1713, the population of Dutchess was so low that it was attached to Ulster County for purposes of administration. The first census taken in 1702 recorded a mere 70 people, approximately 10 to 12 families. A dozen years later, there were about 330 people across 49 families, including a few enslaved people. Even as late as 1731, Dutchess ranked last in population among New York's 10 counties. But the situation was changing, such that according to a census taken in 1737, there were now 3,100 plus white people and 262 enslaved people, about 8%, living in the county. There were 518 family names recorded in the county assessment roll for that year. This growth reflected similar gains in other counties north of New York City. The fur trade up north was dying, and demand for market goods was growing steadily, with New York City on its way to becoming a world center for British trade. The Hudson Valley was being counted on to supply more and more goods. In the half century from 1723 to 1771, the Dutchess population grew 20-fold to more than 22,000 residents, and it jumped from least to second most populous county in the province. Though the settler population was growing rapidly, it still was not enough to satisfy the market demands. Farmers in Dutchess, Ulster, and elsewhere needed more people to do the work. But there was a labor shortage, and many farmers struggled to survive from one year to the next and could not take advantage of the market demand. The larger farmers, bunched close to the river, and even some smaller ones, looked to enslaved people to fill that gap. As demand increased and the white population grew, so too did the enslaved population. The table here shows you the counties of the Hudson Valley and 4 select years and the number of enslaved people counted for those years by the county. By 1750, enslaved people comprised as many as 1/3 of all newcomers to the colony. And New York's enslaved population tripled between 1723 and 1790. 1790 was the high point when there were just under 13,000. That 13,000 was equivalent to 1/2 of the total colony's enslaved population. The decline that we see in the table for the year 1800 reflects to a great extent the reaction to the anticipated impact of the 1799 law setting a date for the ultimate abolition of slavery, which would come in the state in 1827. Looking at the county population with several towns running down the left-hand side and years going across, note that the greatest number of enslaved people by far could be found in the so-called river towns, those adjacent to the Hudson, Fishkill, Poughkeepsie, and Rhinebeck. Why was that? Two main reasons. The land along the river was fertile and mostly free of mountainous areas, and proximity to the river allowed for ease of transportation, both goods arriving into the county and for finished saleable products going out of the county. Now, who were these enslaved people? What kinds of work were they doing in Dutchess? We take a look at diaries, record books, notice of slave sales, and the so-called runaway slave advertisements. There is a lot to learn about these enslaved people and their skills and expertise. Blacksmiths, tailors, boat pilots, master millers, carpenters, wheelwrights, and others. Some of these trades were highly skilled. It might take as many as 8 years before someone was skilled enough to work as a master miller. Likewise, for blacksmithing or other such trades, a boat pilot required knowledge of engineering, ability to read maps, writing, and arithmetic fluency for deciphering bills of lading, etc., and so on and so on. These enslaved people were not simply a mass known as slaves, but a differentiated group of individual people, bought and sold, yes, but put to work based on their skills and the skills they learned as they performed a wide variety of tasks on farms or in towns and cities. Ads identified slaves as, quote, as knowing the farming business or of being a good miller or one who can provide all kinds of housework. Beyond their specific skills, enslaved people had to be adaptable to different kinds of work. While grain production was the mainstay of the Mid-Hudson economy during the 1700s, farmers increasingly diversified their production, say into flax or hemp, as well as fruit orchards. Enslaved men also needed to learn carpentry, clear the fields, build walls, construct barns, tend to livestock. Jacks of all trades they might commonly be known as. But enslaved people had identities and multiple work skills. Collectively, these examples demonstrate a level of agency and individuality of enslaved men and women. With this as a background, we're going to move to a closer examination of the communities in the county and the beginnings of the anti-slavery movement. First phase anti-slavery, Quaker community, free Black communities, and major churches. First phase abolition refers to organized efforts to end slavery in the period roughly between 1750 and 1800s. Perhaps the exemplar of this first phase anti-slavery effort were the Quakers in our own eastern Dutchess County. Throughout the northern colonies, the Quakers played a leading role in trying to eradicate slavery, if only for within their own communities. But the Quakers here played a crucial role within that firmament. And for several years, they actually led the anti-slavery movement. Now, while Quakers have often been described as, quote, friend to the slave, close quote, in fact, they had a very long and complicated history with slavery. It wasn't easy for them to get from accepting slavery to remonstrating against it. From the time they left England to the building of sugarcane plantations in the West Indies, all the way through the settlement of their meetings in colonial Pennsylvania, New York, and elsewhere, Quakers were intimately tied to slavery and the slave trade. many actually advocated for slavery. And in the beginning, they profited from the slave trade and from the slaves they owned. There was no talk of manumission, if anything, just the opposite. However, by the third quarter of the 1600s, a few voices began to ask if it was appropriate for friends to buy and sell slaves. These faint voices of questioning were enough for George Fox and other Quaker leadership to begin promoting what came to be known as, quote, benevolent slaveholding, close quote, an attempt to carefully maintain a path to continued slave ownership. Be sober and fear God, they said to the enslaved people, and love your masters and mistresses, and be faithful and diligent in your master's service and business. That was a message that went out from George Fox in 1671. He and others implored slave owners to treat their enslaved men and women nicely, benevolently. And in return, he asked the slaves basically to grin and bear it. It was an attempt to carefully maintain a path to continued slave ownership while trying to convince Quakers that theirs was a kindly and caring enslavement. But during the late 1600s and early 1700s, more questioning voices from Quakers in Pennsylvania were heard. But there was nothing yet as significant as what was about to happen in Dutchess County. By the 1720s, Quakers began coming up from Long Island and elsewhere and settling in around the Oblong. That's that thin stretch of land running north and south along the eastern edge of the county. In the 1730s, they were given approval to start their own meeting with a building constructed in 1742. And a new meeting house shown here was approved in 1764. If you have not been to the Oblong Meeting House in Paulding, tomorrow you must go, or sometime very soon. It's an absolutely magnificent example of a colonial Quaker meeting. If John or one of the other folks are there, they'll give you a tour, but you definitely should put it on your must-see list. By the 1750s, settlers at the Oblong themselves were expressing strong, growing doubts about the rightfulness of slavery. They were influenced by John Woolman, an itinerant preacher who mounted a powerful attack on slavery. And he stayed for a while and lectured at the Oblong. And in 1767, the Oblong monthly meeting took a momentous step by riling up the waters of Quaker custom. They sent a query to the Purchase Quarterly meeting, and that's to whom they reported on questions of Quaker practice, asking Purchase to reply to its concerns about slaveholding. Their query was titled, "Inconsistency of Slave Keeping with Our Religious Principles." And they asked questions. Slavery is a harm to both slave and owner, is it not? Slavery denies the slave freedom to obey his or her inner light. If it's frowned on to buy and sell slaves, why not the same for owning them? Should Quakers free their slaves? And how can we be diligent Quakers and maintain slavery? With this step, Dutchess Quakers put themselves at the forefront of anti-slavery efforts, not only within the Society of Friends, but in this early organized movement of anti-slavery in the colonies. There were a few other organized anti-slavery efforts going on at this time. The Jay attempt to create the Anti-Slavery Society among the rich and wealthy and still slave-owning folks in New York was another example of these kind of closed organizations to promote the end of slavery. Now, Purchase would not handle the query. They sent a snooty reply that said the tendency of this query was to stir up trouble. And rather than address it, Purchase sent it on to the New York Yearly Meeting, and they tabled it for 2 years. And finally, in 1769, the New York Yearly Meeting dismissed it for fear that manumission would, quote, turn out slaves at large indiscriminately, resulting in great inconveniency, close quote, as indeed it certainly would have for the Quaker hierarchy. Behind the scenes, however, the Oblong Quakers, along with their neighboring 9 partners meeting friends, had already begun to take action against their slave-owning members. For example, they banished several members for buying slaves, and they disowned another for, quote, being familiar in a carnal manner, close quote, with his female slaves. But it was hard going in Dutchess, and it took until 1790 before eastern Dutchess County was totally rid of Quaker slavery. Now, during the late 1700s and early 1800s, there were numbers of free Black people living and working across our area. During the post-revolution period, some owners had already begun manumitting their slaves. Others coming into the county from various locations helped build a large presence of free Blacks, creating vibrant communities that served as early sites of resistance and protest. Often, the newly manumitted Black people would move to areas with an already existing community. A few of them included Freemanville, located near present-day Poughkeepsie in the town of Beekman. It was started in 1818 by a free Black, Charles Freeman, who owned about 3 acres of land that stretched between Beekman and West Pauling. By the time of his death in 1845, there were several hundred free Black people living in that immediate area. Baxtertown, near Fishkill, was originally a free Black settlement where they were living alongside of Wappingers Indians during the colonial period. But because of the heavy concentration of enslaved people in Fishkill, it's likely that a good number of the Baxtertown population had been enslaved. The area was purportedly a station on the Underground Railroad, though we have not been able to find any direct evidence to support the claim. And the third is Guinea Town in Hyde Park, that was home to several dozen free Black families, many of whom became congregants at the nearby St. James Episcopal Church. The church was founded in 1811 by Samuel Bard and continued over the years to be home for African Americans in the area. Richard Jenkins, shown here, was the first sexton of St. James and held that position for 45 years until his death in 1857. Jenkins, who lived in nearby Guinea Town, was formerly enslaved to Dr. Samuel Bard, who founded the church. Jenkins was so valued by the church that his family was given its own plot in the nearby cemetery. Now, in the context of these developing trends within both the white and Black communities of Dutchess County, a native son, James Talmadge, became the center of anti-slavery debate at the national level. Slavery as a national political issue was also just slightly around the corner. Politicians wanted to keep it out of the arena of public debate for fear it would be too volatile. Maintaining a balance among the free and slave states was critical so that the numerical levels in the Senate would remain equal. To threaten that balance could threaten the Union. James Talmadge was born in Stanford, and he followed a path in the national politics which brought him to the United States Congress as a representative for the Poughkeepsie area. Now, responding to a bill that was submitted for the admission of the Missouri Territory to statehood, on February 13th, 1819, Talmadge introduced an anti-slavery amendment to the bill. It led to heated debate both in Congress and around the nation, marking the beginning of a sectional controversy over the expansion of slavery, a controversy which lasted until 1865. And provided, he said, for the bill that was submitted, in other words, I'll vote for it, provided that the further introduction of slavery or involuntary servitude be prohibited, and that all children born within the said state after the admission thereof shall be free at the age of 25 years. Some Southern congressmen threatened that the passage of this amendment would result in a civil war. Talmadge's response to this and to other vilification by Southern slave interests and their sympathizers was adamant. Language of this sort had no effect on me. If a dissolution of the Union must take place, let it be so. If civil war, which gentlemen so much threaten, must come, I can only say, let it come. Though his amendment was ultimately defeated, Talmadge's legacy remains as a strong opponent of the extension of slavery. And he's important not only for his role in the Missouri Compromise, but as a native of Stanford, he provides a powerful link between our national and local history. Dutchess County was right in the middle of this great historic struggle. The churches established by Black communities around the county were powerful centers of support for African Americans. In addition to spiritual support, churches led education programs for Black children, and in the several decades prior to the Civil War, worked to support the end of slavery. The frequently religious tone of anti-slavery language is a reflection of the influence of communities in faith in Poughkeepsie and the surrounding county. Churches often took the lead in the work of so-called moral influence. The African Methodist Episcopal churches in Fishkill and Poughkeepsie played key roles. While they cooperated with white allies in the anti-slavery movement, free Blacks in Dutchess County also organized their own societies for self-help and protest. They worked not only against slavery, but also for such causes as public education, temperance, and the franchise for Black men. Smith Metropolitan AME Zion Church in Poughkeepsie was first founded in 1836, and from its beginnings, the church and its leaders were prominent in the anti-slavery movement. The Reverend J.N. Mars and Uriah Boston were listed as Poughkeepsie sales agents for the Colored American newspaper. Mars was at the time the pastor of AME, and Boston one of its original trustees. Boston was also a frequent contributor of articles and letters both to the Colored American and to Frederick Douglass's paper, the North Star. Other prominent members of AME included the Reverend Nathan Blount, a co-founder of the church and the first teacher at the Lancaster School, the school for African American children in Poughkeepsie. Blount was also a founding member of the Poughkeepsie Anti-Slavery Society and later served on the executive committee of the Dutchess County Anti-Slavery Society. Isaac Deo was both a church member and another of the founding members of the Poughkeepsie Anti-Slavery Society, and other examples as well. Now, the original AME Zion was located on Catherine Street. The current church shown here was constructed in 1910 with a donation from William W. Smith of the Smith Brothers Cough Drop Company. The Lancaster School, or African Free School as it was originally called, occupied the second story of a building at 189 Church Street in Poughkeepsie. And I believe it currently is the home of the Mystic Cafe. Lancaster was formed in 1829 as a school for poor white children in the village. And in the mid-1830s, space was allocated for Black children. It became Poughkeepsie's first known school of its kind and lasted into the 1840s, at which time the education of Black children was moved to the responsibility of the Smith AME Zion Church. Lancaster was also a center for promotion of anti-slavery and Black rights. In 1840, the school hosted a meeting to promote Black voting rights. The meeting protested that, quote, the long deprivation of this right has inflicted a wound in our soul, which is sinking deeper and deeper and cannot and will not be healed until the healing balm of a full and complete enfranchisement has been applied. In 1837, Angelina Grimke became the first white woman in the United States to speak on a political topic to an audience of both men and women. She gave her address at the Lancaster School. After her talk, and she was already very sure of herself as a feminist, she wrote to her sister, "For the first time in my life, I spoke in a promiscuous assembly, but I found that the men were no more to me then than the women." It is significant that a Black institution invited Grimke to speak. The conservative nature of most white anti-slavery congregations and societies forbade women to address these promiscuous or mixed audiences, a fact that would have very important and deleterious consequences later on for the anti-slavery movement. After 1834, African Americans gathered each summer to celebrate British Emancipation Day. On August 1st of that year, Britain outlawed slavery in its West Indian colonies, including Jamaica, Barbados, and other sugar islands. And this was a major milestone in the march toward international abolition. AME Zion Church served as the leader for celebrating this anniversary, which at one time included a procession from the church to College Hill, where Frederick Douglass addressed the crowd. And this past August, the group in Poughkeepsie celebrating the African spirit commemorated that anniversary by holding a performance or a reenactment of the Frederick Douglass address. Now, there was a news article in the Colored American about one of these Emancipation Day celebrations, and that was supplied by another key player in Dutchess County, Samuel Ringgold Ward, who was perhaps the most prominent Black abolitionist who lived in Poughkeepsie. He taught for a while at the Lancaster School, and he was ordained as a minister out of the First Congregational Church in Poughkeepsie. In the 1840s, Ward went on to become a nationally prominent lecturer and organizer against slavery. Now, despite what we've heard so far, which would seem to be a strong and broad anti-slavery impulse in Dutchess County, the Hudson Valley was also known for its hostility toward abolitionists. Even at the height of anti-slavery activities in the third and fourth decades of the 19th century, most places on the Hudson River, lamented Ward, were thoroughly and hopelessly pro-slavery. At one point on his lecture circuit, Ward had the wheels taken off his wagon as a threat and warning. It was just such hostility toward abolitionists that led to the formation of another leading anti-slavery church in the county. First Congregational Church at 269 Mill Street near Market formed after a February 1837 riot in which Samuel Gould, a lecturer for the American Anti-Slavery Society, was prevented from speaking at the Second Presbyterian Church. A mob attended the lecture, shouted down Gould, and then surrounded and threatened him with violence. They followed Gould to the home where he was staying that night and reportedly broke all the windows in the house. Now, members of local churches who had gone to the address were disturbed that their leaders did not make a strong enough protest against the riot. Several left their churches and came out to form the First Congregational Church, whose rule book required all members to oppose, quote, the buying or selling of human beings or holding them in involuntary servitude, close quote. So you could not even join that church unless you were an abolitionist. Of the first 73 men who did join First Congregational, at least 40 were documented members of local anti-slavery societies. Now, we've known for years about the founding of the FCC growing out of that riot. It's a seminal story for the church and stands as a prime example of the barriers faced by anti-slavery activists. My wife and I were searching one day a couple of years ago and found the protest bill or flyer that was distributed to break up that talk. I'm going to read this to you because it's a little fuzzy here, unfortunately. Outrage is the title. Fellow citizens, an abolitionist of the most revolting character is among you, exciting the feelings of the North against the South. A seditious lecture is to be delivered this evening at 7 o'clock at the Presbyterian Church in Cannon Street. You are requested to attend and unite in putting down and silencing by peaceable means this tool of evil and fanaticism. Let the rights of the states guaranteed by the Constitution be protected. February 27th, 1837, the Union forever. And of course, that abolitionist of the most revolting character was Gould. And this was going to be the third lecture he gave that day in Poughkeepsie. Now, the formation of both AME Zion and First Congregational came at a time of the highest ferment of anti-slavery activity in the county. In 1833, the creation of the American Anti-Slavery Society in Boston marked the rise of a new radical anti-slavery presence in the United States. Unlike earlier groups, it called for the immediate emancipation of slaves. During the 1830s, hundreds of new anti-slavery societies were being formed across the North, modeled on the AAS. And we've seen the importance of organized religion and communities in churches, and in hand with these were the organized anti-slavery societies which developed. Dutchess County boasted several of these, and as a result, they became known as an outpost of radical anti-slavery activity. In 1834, just 1 year after the birth of the national ASS, local abolitionists here created the Poughkeepsie Anti-Slavery Society. Their constitution said the fundamental principles of this society are that slavery is a stain upon our national character, that it is founded on injustice and is consequently a sin, that to be silent and inactive in such and tacit assent, to be silent and inactive is a tacit assent to its perpetual existence and a national evil, while a powerful moral influence is the only weapon which might be used against it. 121 citizens of Poughkeepsie signed that constitution. These were a mix of Blacks, including Samuel Ringgold Ward, and whites, men and women. In 1838, Poughkeepsie abolitionists helped to organize a local anti-slavery society in LaGrange. And a leading abolitionist there, Samuel Slate, organized petition drives in the area. Other local societies were formed in Pleasant Valley and Fishkill. Now, we don't expect you to read this, but these petitions followed a fairly similar format, with a statement of grievances and a statement of moral belief, et cetera, regarding anti-slavery, the need for the end of slavery, and then people signed their names to it. And during the 1830s, Congress was flooded with tens and tens and tens and tens of thousands of these petitions coming from local societies across the North, such that they passed or enacted a gag rule, and which was a ban on even mentioning or entering these types of petitions into Congress at all. So they were all kept outside. The Dutchess County Anti-Slavery Society itself was created in 1838, and they held their first convention in 1839. It took up the question of how responsible abolitionist men were to vote in the upcoming New York State elections. Here's the flyer for that first meeting, and they adopted a resolution. Resolved that we will neither vote for nor support the election of any man for president or vice president of the United States, or for governor or lieutenant governor, or for any legislative officer who is not in favor of the immediate abolition of slavery. And at their next convention, the Dutchess County Society adopted an even more radical stance. Resolved that we collectively and severally will do all in our power to assist those brethren coming through the county who may have thus far escaped the iron grasp of tyranny by giving them meat, money, and clothes to enable them to prosecute their journey to a land of liberty. What a fabulous statement of support for the Underground Railroad, although those words are never used in there. Freedom seekers trying to make their way to safety undoubtedly carried this message with them across other parts of the county and outside the county. And with this resolution, the county citizens placed themselves at the forefront of the anti-slavery movement. Speaking of the Underground Railroad, it has for 2 centuries been debated, researched, and unfortunately mythologized. It is an exciting story of slavery and freedom. It's a story of the first civil rights movement, as one historian has described it, and also much romanticized. Finding the truth of the Underground Railroad has been difficult. It was a secretive, though not necessarily secret, operation. Lots of people knew where it was. Lots of people knew how to direct people, etc. People helping runaway slaves were breaking the law. And we know more about some of the people than about specific locations. It's not that there's no evidence. It's just that there is way more speculation than proof. In Dutchess County, we can identify 2 Underground Railroad paths. The first was known as the Quaker Trail to Freedom, and the other, the River Trail to Freedom. As we've seen, Eastern Dutchess had a large Quaker population with an oblong, 9 partners and Oswego, part of what would be called the necklace of Quaker meetings that extended from New York City up to Vermont. Many runaways or freedom seekers began their journey coming out of New York City, headed up toward Purchase and then into Eastern Dutchess County. From there, they could travel on to Massachusetts and Vermont. It was said that Quakers could travel from New York to Burlington without ever sleeping in a non-Quaker house. So too could freedom seekers. Now, David Irish, a devout member of the Quaker meetings in Pauling, has left several letters and pamphlets he wrote denouncing slavery and calling on his neighbors to open their homes to assist freedom seekers. In a memoir by his daughter, Phoebe Wanzer, who is the cover of the book, published in 1890, she recalls that her father's house was constantly filled with people seeking their way north, and that he would serve them meals and keep them for several days until it was safe to move them to the next stop. And a letter from Charles Marriott in Hutchison, Columbia County, to Roland Robinson at the Rokeby Farm in Vermont. He tells Robinson that he is sending him 4 more runaways that, quote, he just received from Irish. At the 9 partners meeting, let me start this way. In 1806, a runaway slave notice looking for the return of Mary. The owner was from Wappingers. She included this information that, quote, I have heard of her being at the 9 partners. Some partial evidence there. Valentine Halleck was a member of the Oswego meeting, also affiliated with 9 partners, and he was a member of the Milton meeting in Marlborough. And there is some evidence that he would move freedom seekers between the 2 locations using the horse ferry near Fishkill Landing. And there are a few pieces of evidence suggesting the presence of Underground Railroad activity in Poughkeepsie. Samuel Ringgold Ward, who we met earlier, was in close contact with David Ruggles, who led the New York Vigilance Committee. Ruggles visited Poughkeepsie on several occasions, perhaps even teaching at the Lancaster School for a time, and it's possible that he would have moved runaways up from New York to meet with Ward. Moses Roper made a successful escape from slavery in South Carolina, and in a memoir he wrote later in life, he reported receiving medical assistance from a woman in Poughkeepsie. George W. Sterling was the only white resident of Poughkeepsie who was identified in a local obituary as having been active in managing the machinery of the Underground Railroad. Also, steamboats were beginning to have a much greater effect on traffic, moving goods now up the river rather than overland. And there we do have a lot of evidence of runaways being stowed on board ships. Some of them would stop here in Poughkeepsie, so it's possible that there was some movement of freedom seekers in that form as well. But there is one last important and well-known story which links the Underground Railroad with the breadth of anti-slavery action in Poughkeepsie. John Boulding was born into slavery on a plantation near Columbia, South Carolina. When Boulding's owner, Townsend Dickinson, took ill, he sold Boulding to two other men from whom Boulding escaped around 1840. He fled north, accompanied by his younger brother and a few others. They came to Poughkeepsie, where one of the people, Susan, married an African-American, Francis Moore. Now, after passage of the harsh new Fugitive Slave Act, a white visitor from South Carolina recognized Boulding in Poughkeepsie and alerted his former master. In August of 1851, Boulding was seized at his tailor shop by U.S. Marshals, taken to New York City, tried in a special federal court. It was determined that indeed he was an enslaved person and he had to be sent back. So Boulding, having no legal recourse, was sent back to slavery, and his case was a national sensation, one of the more famous of those that were held under the Fugitive Slave Act. However, the citizens of Poughkeepsie, local abolitionists, immediately agreed to buy Boulding's freedom, and his owner agreed to accept around $2,000 in costs and for the sale. Boulding returned to Poughkeepsie and lived there with his wife, Henrietta, until his death. Now, coming to the end of this period, or the end of the period up to the Civil War, as the threat of war grew closer, the anti-slavery communities continued to fight for emancipation. Now, in 1860, Moses Coit Tyler was just 25 years old when he was called to be the pastor at the First Congregational Church in Poughkeepsie. On the eve of Abraham Lincoln's inauguration, on March 22nd, 1861, Tyler led a service and preached a remarkable sermon titled "Our Solace and Our Duty in This Crisis." In that sermon, Tyler called for, quote, "no further concessions to slavery. If adhering to the right will not save the Union," he said, "then the Union is not worth saving." In defiant language akin to that heard from James Talmage 40 years before, he argued that, quote, "while disunion and war and devastation are a great evil, there is yet one evil, evermore and everywhere infinitely greater. That is slavery." And that concludes this primer on this big and complicated history for our wonderful county. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Peter. I have enabled everyone to unmute themselves if they want to ask a question, but right off the bat, we have some great questions in the chat. So the first of these comes from Mark Day, and he asks, did the presence of the Palatine Germans brought to the East and West camps during the years 1710 and 1711 have an impact on decreasing the need for slaves in the northwestern portion of Dutchess County and southwestern portion of what would become Columbia County?
That's a good question. I'm sure it had some impact. I actually am a descendant of one of those Palatines. You know, they had a very unsuccessful attempt at some of the businesses there. I would have to take a little bit more, a little closer look at some of the tables for the enslaved people and the census populations to see to what degree that might have had an impact. But a rush of new workers in any particular area would certainly have had some impact, but I can't quantify what it is at this point. But that's an interesting thing to follow up on.
Great. Thank you for that question. We have another one that is more of a research-based question from Jay India, who says, I have a barn on my property that was built in the 1850s. It's in Milan, and I can only find so much information. How would I go about finding out if my property has a slavery or anti-slavery history? Thank you.
Thanks. First, to clarify, were you referring to a barn? Is that what?
Yeah, she has a barn that's on her property that definitely dates to 1850, but I think she's interested in seeing if the property in general had any relation to slavery or anti-slavery history.
Sure. Do we have a home rather than a barn on that site? And if we do, the first thing we have to do is do an age check. If it was built after 1863, it's 99.99% not a site of the Underground Railroad. If you have a home that was built in the 1810s, 20s, 30s, et cetera, 40s, the next thing you have to do is find out who lived in that house. By looking at who lived there, and you know, you can go to census, there might be other town or county records that will help you try to identify directories, et cetera, that would help you identify who was living in that house. And then if you can find out something about their lives, I know a lot of times this will be very, very, very difficult. But if they had any, if you can now go sideways, did they know people? Were they part of a community? What church perhaps can you find out that they worshiped at or were affiliated with? There are going to be piecemeal connections here and there that might help lead up to. I just had a really oh, by the way, forget about hidden walls, forget about cellars, forget about attics. They don't tell you anything other than the house had hidden walls and attics and cellars. There was a lot of smuggling going on, the Revolutionary War, and there were rooms for storage of goods, et cetera. But if you're asking about cellars and hidden rooms and attics, you'll get nowhere by doing that. They were so commonplace. It's one of the most asked questions about, was my home on the Underground Railroad? But a fascinating discussion, and Will, this goes to the Underground Railroad Consortium. One of the ways that historians have looked at the existence of runaways on sites is they have taken a look at the censuses. And I believe beginning in 1850, don't hold me to that, but I believe in 1850, the census began to ask the question, place of birth. And by following the names of people in the census, we wound up finding in some cases that Black people had listed 3 or 4 different places of birth. Now, does that prove that and these were all in the South. In other words, they weren't up in New York or Ohio or whatever. So that doesn't prove that they had run away. but it provides some little piece of evidence that you can keep going on. We can go more into this, but the first thing you absolutely have to do is, what year was the house built? Can you find out who the people are that live there, and what was their affiliations? What were their affiliations within the community? And then we take it from there.
All right, thank you, Peter. Barbara Sweet from Clinton asks, could you speak about their music? And I don't know if Barbara wants to enlarge on who she's talking about in that particular question, or provide any other details.
Barbara's remembering our singing when we did the Marist Symposium. Barbara, I assume you're referring to the abolitionist music during this period of the 1800s?
That's correct, Peter.
Yeah. Well, some of you, I'm sure, participated in the civil rights movement or other movements, the women's movement, et cetera. All of these reform movements used music to communicate their message. In the case of abolitionists, we have identified over 700 abolitionist songs that were written and performed during this period. And what's the quickest way to spread the word about anti-slavery when you're using a song? You put the new lyrics to existing music. You think about Auld Lang Syne, and you think about our own national anthem. So what the singers would do, and probably the most famous group during this period were the Hutchison family singers coming out of New Hampshire. They themselves wrote, Jesse Hutchison wrote dozens and dozens of songs. And so they would be sung across the North, some even down in the South before they all got kicked out. And, you know, they would write songs like A Way to Freedom, using a minstrel song, no less, from Stephen Foster. I'm on my way, da, da, da. And they also, there was a whole series of protest songs related to national songs like My Country 'Tis of Thee, My Country 'Tis of Thee, stronghold of slavery, of thee I sing. So very important way to spread the word. Thank you for that question, Barbara.
Great. So Jennifer Cook asks, and I know this question was on my mind as well after seeing your presentation, where is Bolding's grave?
It's, you didn't mention it. It's in the Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that. Yes.
That's okay.
It's in the rural cemetery. Yep.
We can still see that marker and the monument.
Yes, absolutely.
Today.
Yep.
Great. Pamela Bentine notes that the Underground Railroad Education Center in Albany has information about freedom seekers who pass through Albany arriving by steamboat.
Yes, that is a great and important site because Harriet and Stephen Myers, formerly enslaved, led the push in that area for helping runaways. And the folks who run that, Paul and Mary Liz Stewart, are absolutely wonderful. They have a fantastic program up there that just a magnificent area for understanding the Pamela, I see you're raising your thumb there. Yes, so if you've been up there, that's another great place to visit, is the Stephen.
Well, I live in Troy.
What's
Sorry,
that?
I live in Troy, and I've been.
Well, yeah, you're right nearby. Sure. Yes.
And I've been there.
Stephen Myers.
They're wonderful folks. Very
Yes.
good research there.
Yes. Yep. There was an important development, if I can just, speaking of other places around, you heard me talk about the fight for the franchise for Blacks in 1821, and then again in 1846, the New York legislature still decided that it was only white men who didn't have to pay to vote. But Black men still had to find a way to prove that they had, I think it was $250 worth of wealth. And so when that was redone in the 1840s, Garrett Smith, some of you have probably heard of Garrett Smith, also a very, very wealthy person, he donated land up near Lake Placid. It was called Timbuktu, enough to hold 1,000 Black families. And what he did is he sent his agents around to every county in New York State, and he made a roll of Blacks who would be invited, Black families who would be invited to go start a farmstead up there. And he did this because he was furious at the continued exclusion of Black men from the vote. So he was hoping that by giving them farms, they could work the farms and establish their own, beginning to establish their own wealth, such that they would then be able to vote. Now, the project turned out to be a bust. I mean, can you imagine running a farm in Lake Placid in the middle of December? No. And most of the people who would have been invited were no longer involved in farming. So it failed for several reasons, but the gesture was tremendous. We have the rolls of all of, I say all, which historians are not supposed to do. We have the rolls of the Black families from Dutchess County. I have a copy that I got from Martha Swan up at Timbuktu. That's another place to visit. John Brown lives site in West Elba, a few miles from Lake Placid.
Yes. So Pam Malcolm, who is the director at Statsburg State Historic Site in Hyde Park, asks, you mentioned the strong anti-slavery sentiment that counterbalanced the abolition movement in DC. And I'm going to guess that's kind of pro-slavery or anti-abolition sentiment.
Yep.
Can you say any more about the adherents to that movement? Were they farmers, large landowners? What do we know about them?
A lot of them were farmers. A lot of them, I don't know necessarily large landowners, but the issue of anti-slave, and by the way, I should also mention that our good friend James Talmage was very, very lukewarm on the franchise. In 1821, when the Constitution was being rewritten, he basically said, well, listen, you know, not very many Black people are going to vote anyway, so it's okay if we have a provision in the new Constitution that says that you have to have a certain amount of wealth. But in terms of the opposition, there was intense opposition across the board in New York to the anti-slavery movement. It came from a lot of areas. I mean, we're outside of New York City, but New York City was a major stronghold for pro-Southern positions. The reason there being is that New York City was the center of trading and financing, and they couldn't afford to lose their Southern customers. When you get up into this part of the area, it was a real mixture of businessmen, some who would have been involved in the market economy on the river, other farmers who were upset about the abolition law that finally went into play in 1827 or was finalized in 1827. So it was a mix of people, and the fights were bitter. The fights were bitter. I might just jump ahead to the Civil War. There has been for many years a lot of debate and books going back and forth and studies and letters studied, et cetera, about why people fought in the war. If you were from the North, what was your motivation for going into the war? And it might have changed. You might have gone into the war, like we saw that poster shouting down Samuel Gould. That was a legitimate and very deeply held position if we trust the language they used, which was they're trying to split the Union, these anti-slavery people. They're trying to split us apart, and we don't want the Union to split apart. So there's a lot of that mixed in here as well. They did not like the abolitionists, some of them, because they were worried that the abolitionists, if they went too far, was going to result in splitting the United States in half, and they didn't want that to happen.
All right, thank you, Peter. John Vincent asks, is there any way to know just how accurate those censuses were with regards to the slave counts? Could they have been undercounting, overcounting? Do we know?
I don't know. Do you know, Will? Because you've looked at all, you know, I hate to say it, but we had an election last year where there were a lot of people who thought stuff was undercounted or overcounted. I have not run across anything. The numbers that I was using tonight for, especially as you get into when the censuses are being taken, you trust or not trust to whatever degree. Now here in New York, we do have some luck. We have some additional luck because for several decades, New York was taking its own census every 5-year increments off the federal census years. So there's another checkup you can do there. You get the 1850 US Census and then take a look at the 1855 New York State Census. And of course, by that time, slavery was ended. But there would be some other ways perhaps to check the accuracy. You know, we do take some things on faith. We try to check whatever we can possibly check.
Yeah, I don't think it would have benefited anyone to either under or over report number of slaves in Dutchess County. So,
Yeah.
Robert Gusty asks, do you know any details from the Quaker Church on North Quaker Road in Hyde Park? And I think that's the Crumb Elbow meeting.
Oh, my friend Denise Burns. If you know Denise, you should. If you don't know Denise and you want to know about Crumb Elbow, I can put you in touch with Denise. That's what she holds on to. Another, the Del Garmo family lived up there, Quakers. There, once again, it's one of these places where there are hints of Underground Railroad activity at Crumb Elbow, but nothing that we haven't worked on it. She's been trying to do research, a lot of research, as much as she possibly can. They're going to be doing a couple of digs. I believe they got the funding for it, a couple of digs in the cemetery, hoping that there's some indication that there are some other burials there on that site. The best we can say right now is there might have been, but we just don't have any proof.
Speaking of proof, W. Hill asks, could you mention Sojourner Truth's Hudson Valley connections? Now, I know there's a lot of that evidence in Ulster County, but I'm not sure about here in Dutchess.
I don't know about Duchess so much. She was kept pretty tightly held she was enslaved from the time she was born until she became a runaway within the last year of slavery in New York State. I'm not aware of, probably Myra Armstead at Bard knows the answer to that question, but I'm not familiar with any activity in Dutchess County. And then after she was given her freedom, she spent about 2 decades dabbling in different things. She spent several years in New York City. She was involved with I don't know, today we might call it a cult religious group for several years. And it wasn't until I think almost 20 years after slavery that she finally found her new mission, which was to advocate for anti-slavery and for women's rights. I'm not familiar with any activities she might have had in outside of Ulster County.